Hello, welcome to Philosophy Instrumentals. I'm your host.
We don't even have names!
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Philosophy Instrumentals. Today we're going to speak on Laclau Mouffe with our special guest, Ed, from A New Conversation.
Hey.
Thank you for being here with us today, Ed. Give us a quick introduction to you and your show.
I'm Ed from A New Conversation, which is a left-wing political education collective currently involving myself and Ollie. Basically, we log our political education through podcast discussions and video essays that we put up on YouTube and Spotify for those who are interested. And I suppose the aim is to propagate that political education and also maybe overcoming some unnecessary infighting that happens among the left and identifying ways to defeat far-right rhetoric.
What distinguishes Laclau Mouffe from, say, other Marxist theorists?
So for Laclau Mouffe, I think their major work, Hegemony and Social Strategy, which was published originally in the mid-80s, having witnessed the influence of the anti-democratic orthodoxy in Marxism that led to the neoliberal right coming to power during the 70s, Laclau Mouffe argued that a dogmatic interpretation of Marx's work failed to adapt to the realities of society as it developed. And I believe Marx himself would agree, as per his notion of praxis, which is the development of theory through its application to real-life struggles. So Laclau Mouffe used the term post-Marxism not as a label, which obviously it became later, but they use it as a signifier for this argument and the need to continually deconstruct the theory and then reconstruct it in terms of realities that any given position faced, so that to save it from becoming static and mere dogma. There's a lot that can be gone into here, but an illustrative difference their argument amounts to is if we take Kautsky's vision of the strictly proletarian universal subject, or universal revolutionary subject, while Laclau Mouffe don't dispute the impacts of capitalist classes and the need for an anti-capitalist struggle, based on what they witnessed in the 70s, sort of the arrival of new social movements. Laclau Mouffe argue that a static concept of class failed the possibility of an effective left-wing movement in terms of incorporating those new social movements into a wider popular front, I guess. Many criticised Laclau Mouffe for being postmodernist with respect to the possibility of a universal subject, but in fact what they were arguing for was a universal subject of particularities, a self-identifying working class from below rather than one defined from above, also possessing the capacity to articulate their own narratives of subjugation to power in whatever form that may take.
Why do Laclau and Mouffe say that revolutions are unnecessary?
In Hegemony and Social Strategy, Laclau Mouffe outlined the need for left-wing movement to counter the material effects of neoliberal discursivity that sought to identify certain subject positions as social negatives, the welfare scrounger, for instance. Their socialist strategy then consisted of de-articulating such neoliberal subjectivities and then re-articulating them along different lines, presumably identifying capitalists as social negatives. With this in mind, they argued such a left-wing movement should not renounce liberal democratic ideology, but to recognise it as a fundamental theatre for struggle in which the left seek to overdetermine its democratic dimension. They do recognise this amounts to a democratic revolution. However, they state that a barrier to such is the left that I mentioned before, who essentialise the revolutionary subject in a crystallised preconception that bars the working class to define itself through its own struggles, while also seeking to totalise society. That means, to pursue revolutionary means to essentialise a preconceived end. Again, I don't believe Marx outlines such preconceived notions of what a communist society might look like, spending much of his time arguing against utopian socialists for their anti-democratic pursuit from above. Laclau Mouffe specify revolution here in the Jacobin sense, and if we look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, while there were a few revolutionary ruptures along the way, of course, it otherwise took a very long time with a non-linear model of progress. In her latest work, a couple of years old now, For Left Populism, Mouffe addresses the charges against her of being a reformist. She states that positing reform and revolution in terms of a dichotomy is a mistake. Her hegemonic form sort of mirrors neoliberalism's discursive revolution, which amounts neither to the rupture of what she calls the extreme left, nor the sterile attenuation of capitalism proposed by social liberals such as Clinton and Blair and those who came after them. I'd argue, however, that While in the transition from social democracy to neoliberalism, hegemonic agencies struggle to determine contingent points in society and re-articulate them. One thing that's failed to prove contingent in this time, and that is capitalism and class that have existed throughout. I'd also argue that rupturous revolutions won't not have their place. We can't really stop them if they do tend to arise, and some have already occurred on our road to socialism. But I think that the term revolution should mean a grander social turning, like in terms of those couple of hundred years it took for feudalism to transition into capitalism. Finally, on this point, I would argue against Laclau Mouffe that both revolution and the universal subject need not be the horizon of the left, but the means to achieve that horizon. And what I mean by that is they don't need to determine from above our post-capitalist future, but they can help inspire from below that post-capitalist moment.
Can you elaborate on the terms hegemony and agonism?
Taking agonism first, it's central to Mouffe's work in particular and draws on a radical democracy and the idea that the left should hegemonize liberal democracy. Situating their argument in Freud's group psychology, Laclau Mouffe recognised the inherency of social antagonisms. In a very basic sense, this means our libidinal drive brings us to love, but to love we must also hate, and this dynamic generates groups, those we identify with and the others we identify in opposition to. In Mouffe's radical democracy, political positions arise infinitely as elements become solid. For instance, in a revolutionary moment, a group of people with shared grievances cause society to become fluid and to change. As the revolution settles and some sort of central leading authority forms, society takes a more solid form against which invariably new grievances will arise, because that centrality will, like I said, invariably exclude some positions. And with those new grievances, new political positions will arise. In radical democracy, these antagonisms, an antagonism being a conflict between two enemies seeking to exterminate the other, in radical democracy, they become political adversaries instead. They become agonists rather than antagonists. The political institution here is predicated on the mutual respect and enforcement of the other's right to advance their political position in hegemonic struggle, and any position that arises that seeks to operate in terms of antagonism and thus failing to respect and enforce that right of the other, instead hoping to exterminate them, must be expelled from the political system for the existential threat they represent to that system. This is exemplified in the relationship between liberals and Democrats in a liberal democracy, the positions of which aren't harmonious but in constant conflict and tension. And through that tension, and particularly when historically the liberal element overdetermines the democratic aspect, the far right emerges, and the far right presenting that existential threat, and so must always be suppressed. Hegemony then, which I've mentioned a few times now, is the discursive struggle to overdetermine an element of liberal democracy, either liberalism or democracy. Instead of pursuing a radical departure from the system, a hegemonic struggle seeks to assert nodal points in a war position, influencing common sense among the relevant population, to eventually gain enough power to assert the meaning over, for instance, freedom and equality, which are the two constitutive values of a liberal democracy. Neoliberalism, being conceived early last century, defined its goals in terms of determining what freedom and equality ought to mean, and they set about building an infrastructure which eventually amounted to the likes of Thatcher and Reagan coming to power. Their project would not have succeeded without this previous intellectual and material project running behind the scenes for decades before. The left, of course, could have taken the next electoral opportunity to overturn the neoliberals, though when it came to the opportunity, and this is a testament to the power of the neoliberal hegemonic project, Clinton and Blair opted to maintain neoliberalism, merely seeking to curb its harshest manifestations. And this is the moment hegemony is achieved, the moment that people forgot an alternative was possible. The reawakening of this belief is the point of Laclau Mouffe's hegemonic strategy.
What do you envision a civil society to look like?
In the early work that followed Hegemony and Social Strategy, compiled in Return of the Political, I think, from the early 90s, Mouffe spends a little time outlining the importance of civil society, and I think the gist of it is that a struggle for radical democracy could be founded on citizen identities. Mouffe fashions such an identity between the liberal and communitarian conception of the term citizen with the help of Machiavelli. The common good was too imposing, and pure personal pursuit was too socially dissolving. So instead, there needed to be a personal pursuit that recognised the mutual obligation of belonging to a citizenry. A calculated selflessness, where our freedom must be practised in terms of the freedom of others, or it will be lost. I was never really engaged by this argument. It's fine, but I was more inclined to focus on the possible contours of a working class of particularities, rather than a preconceived identifier such as the citizen identity, which I know she's only putting it forward as a suggestion, but if we look at Laclau's work on populism, he argues we can never know in advance the position that will assume a movement's master signifier, let alone their anti-essentialist stance in Hegemony and Social Strategy. When we think of such a working class movement and the institutions of civil society, it does get a bit more interesting. Returning to far left populism, for instance, Mouffe raises the Gramscian notion of becoming state, and I think this concept is reflected in Mark Fisher's capitalist realism too. While states may be seized, for Gramsci, Mouffe and Fisher, its seizing or the sort of the withering away is not so crucial, but how through engaging in existing political power, the branches of state might be altered in terms of their operations. And in this sense, it's possible for a strong political movement to draw down sovereignty, so to speak. This isn't so much about delivering a vanguard party to government, more so a party constituted by a larger movement, with an explicit aim once getting there to, as I said, draw down sovereignty. And it might take place, like, initially by nationalising public services and then regionalising them, and delivering further power to the peripheries of the state and its society in a continual fashion, so that eventually the direct operators of those services are the base of that movement in their locations, basically communities operating and managing state provision for themselves, by themselves. And such a process implies a constant class struggle, and while it might not finalise an anti-capitalist moment, it does open up the horizon of possibility of such through practising the practical benefits of some anti-capitalist principles. Also, for the left to succeed, it needs to recognise that every frontier it may conceive is a frontier of the struggle, or for the struggle. It makes no sense to ignore the state as a site for struggle, nor to perceive such a strategy as foregoing the working towards an anticipation of more radical or rupturous junctures.
Why is it we need Marx today?
Laclau Mouffe were writing at a time and place of peak material equality. The cultural term was taking place as argument for change based on material disenfranchisement in Europe and the US was a hard task. I guess in the past, the direct material conditions, one's relationship to the means of production, and a more clear and definitive class structure lent itself to Marx's analysis and his work, which is obvious because that was when he was writing it. However, since, while the material base has not changed how it impacts people, what has changed is the directness in which people interpret those conditions, experience and interpret those conditions, actually. If we recognise the 20th century as beginning in a classical capitalist sense of extreme concentrated wealth, leading to imperial conquest, of course, then undertaking an enormous upheaval of that order, with that wealth initially being dispersed into efforts of state warfare and then through giant rebuilding efforts, while at the same time the value of labour as a commodity shot up due to its sudden scarcity after it was slaughtered on a number of occasions. We get the blip in our history that was social democracy. Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism is crucial here, as it encapsulates the relationship between the material and ideological conditions of what comes after that moment, after social democracy. Knowing that a swift reversion to the pre-war way of the world would have indeed led to outright revolution, society's elites would be patient in clawing back their wealth, and in the meantime set about convincing everyone else that their efforts to re-attain this wealth was for the benefit of society as a whole. And this is neoliberal ideology and capitalist realism. And as Laclau and Mouffe argue, it is certainly essential that the left overturn this ideology. However, while all this goes on, the actual process of reacquisitioning wealth from the large elements of the working class in Europe and the US that managed to get hold of it brings us right back to a critique of political economy, as well as works such as Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. I think if we look back at the arguments unfolding among the emergent left about 20 years ago and through the initial years of the US supposed war on terror, so much effort was consumed in attempting to identify whether or not what was going on was empire. And of course it was. And I wonder if the likes of Marx and Lenin were as popular then as they are becoming today, what the left would look like today. But of course, those works were thoroughly out of vogue then, generally speaking, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think we've always needed Marx, and sure, in a way proposed by Laclau Mouffe as a body of work that we endeavour to keep alive by knowing it so thoroughly, and not through the filter of would-be Marxists such as Kautsky, that we can adapt it to the development of capital, to be able to identify and articulate class and economic subjugation despite the chimeric adaptations taken by capital to disguise its overwhelmingly negative impacts on society.
Are you a Marxist?
Maybe it's because I was born at the tail end of Generation X, but I've never been too concerned with labelling myself or defining my identity. I've been more concerned with how power identifies groups, what material implications derive from such identification, and how might people struggle against such identifications to improve their material conditions. With respect to Marx, I agree with much of what I've read of his work, and in looking at the history of socialism, I far prefer his and how he synthesises it with democracy to other variants. And this seems sort of contrary, I suppose, to much of what comes under the term Marxism. I guess at least starting with Kautsky's orthodoxy in the SPD. Many have asked the question, would Marx be a Marxist if he were still alive or if he had lived on? I think then stemming from Marx's writing, synthesising socialism and democracy, the left have a solid but negative anti-capitalist goal for a struggle for a stateless, moneyless, classless society. And that's certainly something that the left should keep in mind and to rally around. And while I feel it's implied, also I'd explicitly add a stateless, moneyless, classless society of localised democracies.
Thanks so much, Ed. Do you have any last words at all?
Let me see. So a new conversation is coming up to being a year old now. We initially hoped to get 2 podcast series out a year. So we're rushing our next one to be out early next year. This will focus on rhetoric and the alt-right. But by early next summer, we do hope to get our 3rd season out. So we're back on track. And that's actually going to look at why we need Marx today, funnily enough. More immediately, though, we've finally got our podcast feed up on Spotify. Our latest one is an exploratory discussion on Marx and postmodernism between myself and One Dime, who also has a great YouTube channel, so look him up. We hope to get some old and new podcasts out on Spotify weekly over the next month or so before we get the new series out. So please do check it out. Follow us on Twitter and look us up on YouTube. Presumably the links will be below. So yeah, thanks very much.